Hey, it's Drybear. Back again with another Diablo 4 build guide, and today we'll be talking about my Bone Shrapnel Necromancer. We just, on the last video, talked about the Bone Spirit single target bone damage build, but there are several bone builds that you can use for Necromancer. And today is going to be a build focused on using Bone Spear, and that Bone Spear, as well as Bone Splinters, fragmenting and shattering and spreading bone everywhere. Thus the Bone Shrapnel. These kind of builds are some of my favorites in these ARPGs because you can get a mixture of single target and AoE in a singular simple build that feels really good. But first, you should come hang out with me on my live stream. I'm live every single day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come hang out with me in the community. If you don't come hang out, the next time you get a milkshake, the straw they give you is going to be just ever so slightly shorter than the cup the milkshake is in, which means you can't stick it all the way down to the bottom and let go. You have to hold the straw slightly above the lip of the cup, which isn't really all that much of an inconvenience, but it's an extra thing you have to do while enjoying your milkshake. All right, let's talk about the Bone Shrapnel Necro. If you looked at the critical mass, the Bone Spirit build for Necromancer that I had made, it's gonna have some similarities because it is still a bone caster build for Necromancers. There's a lot of synergies that go with bone in general, the key passive, any of the ossified bonuses, legendaries, so on and so forth. But if you're looking for a full build guide, I have made the entire build on d4builds.gg. You'll find a link to this down in the description, and you can also join the Discord where I have all of the builds that I've made for Diablo 4 in a D4 Builds channel, as well as a Diablo channel for discussions for answering questions. So come hang out on the Discord, that's linked down in the description as well. So let's go through the Bone Shrapnel build for Necromancer. Starting with our builder, if you look at any of the ossified passives, many of them trigger off of multiple instances of dealing bone damage. Every 10th hit of bone, every bone crit that you get, bone skills lower the cooldown on bone. It makes it very easy to pick up the only bone damage builder that we have, which is Bone Splinters. So this one is not going to be your main source of damage. It just builds essence when you fall behind. You do get some nice chances to increase your crit chance, which is a little bit less accessible than it was for the Bone Spirit build, but for this one, you will kind of get the benefit there. If you find that you don't need the crit chance when you're fully geared, you can move over and pick up the vulnerability, because again, even if you don't have modifiers for vulnerability, it is still a damage amp, so it's easy to pick that up and pick that up. So your builder here is going to be Bone Splinters. However, unlike the Bone Spirit build, we're not going to be spending all of our essence on one ability. We will want to pick up a core skill here, and that's going to be the creme de la creme, the centerpiece for this build, Bone Spear. So this is your core skill. This is your spender. This is how you will be spending your essence. So we want to max this out for max damage. And then the modifiers we want is Bone Spear breaks into 3 shards when it is destroyed, dealing 25% damage each, so it splits. We have other ways to modify this to make it even more fun. And then we're going to pick up the increased crit chance. If its primary projectile crits, it fires 2 additional bone shards upon being destroyed, which increases that more. And again, we have modifiers we'll talk about in a minute to pick that up. For bone passives, this time we're going to pick up Max Essence, which just allows us to, when we have high generation, get more value out of that essence generation. And then since we are using a core skill, we do want to have the cost go up, but the damage increase or more than the cost goes up. And as we get better at generating essence, we'll be able to benefit from this quite a lot. Coming down to the next part of the tree, we do want to pick up Bone Prison. This one is a very, honestly, the more I play Necromancer, the more I realize how many uses Bone Prison has. At first, it just seems like a trap, but the fact that you can cause it to shatter and explode, the fact that you can gain essence from it, the fact that you can apply vulnerable if you so choose, and the way you can block off minions and enemies, you can separate mobs, you can isolate mobs, you can spawn things on it. Like the usage of Bone Prison is so deep, and I think we're going to keep figuring out how awesome this ability is as we play the game longer and longer. But I do like picking it up. It is a bone skill, so when you reset bone cooldowns, it will affect Bone Prison as well, which is a nice bonus. We do like picking it up that when you trap people or enemies in a Bone Prison, you'll get 15 essence per for the first enemy, and then 5 per enemy trap that's in there, and then enemies inside become vulnerable. It's a nice damage amp. You don't need Fortify for this build because I don't think this fits for an Overpower. If you do decide to go for an Overpower bone build, then you do want the Fortify here, but I don't think for this build specifically, we will be running for that. Next, we're going to pick up Death's Reach, because once we have this build in full swing, we're going to be setting bone shrapnel in all directions all over the screen. And so majority of the enemies you're going to be shooting at, even the ones you don't intend to hit, are going to get hit by your bone fragments. And so you will be dealing damage at a distant. And you can also position yourself to do this as well. So we want to increase this 12% increased damage for distant is going to be huge for this. Next, under Macabre, we're going to pick up the Corpse Tendrils. This is an awesome build for Corpse Explosion, but it's even better for casters, and we'll see why once we go over the legendaries. But this one is awesome because it pulls in enemies, it stuns them. We do get some benefits for CC targets, and it does a little bit of damage to them, but we can also modify it so that they're slowed as well, which is a crowd control effect and helps gather enemies. But we can also get it to drop a Blood Orb. We do want some Blood Orb options here because we can get some damage scaling from that, which is really nice on top of that. And it also gives us some bonuses that we'll talk about in just a minute. For Bone, since it's a Bone casting build, we want to pick up all of the Bone passives here under the Macabre tree. Serration gives you increased crit chance for each 10 essence you have upon spending. This one's just kind of going to get rolling. We're not going to get as much essence or not as much crit chance as we did with the Bone Spirit build. So the crit here is going to be pretty nice. After critting with Bone Skills, your Bone Skills deal increased damage. Again, if you have enough crit, you should be able to maintain this buff basically indefinitely. It all depends on your gear and how well your build is coming together, but at a certain point, you should be able to have this up almost all the time. And then with Rapid Ossification, every 100 essence you spend reduces the cooldown of Bone Skills. So as we're throwing out the Bone Spears, spending essence, we're going to be able to reset the cooldowns, which again, resets the cooldown for Bone Prison and your ultimate, which is also your Bone Storm. So that kind of gives you a nice little benefit there. And then lastly, you deal increased critical damage to vulnerable enemies. We get vulnerable for free off of the Bone Prison. And then I think once you get later on, if you don't need the crit chance here from Bone Splinters, you can get the vulnerable from Bone Splinters as well, which is a nice pickup. Obviously, as we come down here, we will want to pick up the only Bone Ultimate we have available, Bone Storm. Love this one. Super clean, super fun. It's a very flexible ultimate that has some nice legendaries that make it even more flexible. And we're also going to be sacrificing our Skeletal Warriors and Skeletal Mages, which means we get benefit from standalone. Gives us damage reduction, reduced for each active minion. We're running Bone Storm, so I would recommend running a Golem because you get double effect from that, which is nice, as long as you can keep the Golem alive. And for this build, it should be pretty easy to do so. And then also sacrificing both your Skeletal Warriors and your Skeletal Mages increases their sacrifice bonuses by quite a lot. You get some really nice bonuses from this. So this here is going to be great. If you find that your Golem is dying too much, there's an option here for Golem Mastery, and you can also change up your Paragon to make your Golem even tankier. Next is Ossified Essence. This works great for all Bone skills, and Bone Spear is no exception. They deal increased damage for each point of essence you have above 50 when you cast. So you can actually get up to 50% increased damage at base, but remember that we have other options here, increasing our essence by 9 from Unliving Energy, and then from our Paragon and other options, we should be able to get it up even further, which means we can get up to about double damage, if not a little bit more, just from having the Ossified Essence passive by default unmodified. So those are your 5 abilities plus your Golem spawning, which is great. Also give that extra benefit there. When it comes to minions, as we said, we are going to have a Golem. And I think the best one here is going to be the corpse generating Bone Golem. You have actually a couple options here. I think unlike the Bone Spirit build where Vulnerable was a little bit more viable, the Iron Golem made a lot of sense, but I actually really like spawning more corpses here because you have plenty of ways to benefit from this. And it also means you can go into the Flesh Eater Paragon board and get some more benefits from corpse eating there that is even better. So I like having the extra corpses here from your Bone Golem. And of course, we're running Bone Storm. I like having a Golem with that because it gives you 2 Bone Storms instead of 1. And when he's in melee range, it spreads out the effect of Bone Storm. Bone Storm hits very often, and we like having that because there's so many different benefits that come from hitting with Bone skills regularly. So that's what we're looking for there. When we look at our minions, your Skeletal Warriors and Skeletal Mages, for this build, I recommend sacrificing your Skirmishers, which gives you crit chance. It's a free 5% crit chance. Very nice, but remember, it's 5% by default. Not 5% what you're going to get, but 5% by default. Because remember, we're getting the Memento Mori, which is increase the sacrifice bonuses by 60%. So you can get almost 8 or 9 crit just from this effect. So this gets scaled up, which makes it even better. And then I also recommend sacrificing your Cold Mages because this means that you deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies, which gives you the bonus. If you feel like you don't get too much value out of this to spread, if you end up with Bone Splinters not getting the vulnerable, or you run not the vulnerable on Bone Prison, you can also just go for max essence, sacrificing the Shadow Mages, but it is an option for you to pick up as well. Now let's talk about the legendaries and where to put these. There's some really easy pickups here for Bone in general, and then there's some really fun ones for Bone Spear. I actually cannot wait to run this build fully maxed out and just see what it does to all enemies on the screen. The first one we're going to talk about is a unique item. These come at late game, at end game. You're not going to get these while leveling, but it's something to look forward to because they do modify your build quite a bit. And that's the Deathless Visage. This one makes it so when you cast Bone Spear, it leaves behind Bone Spear echoes as it travels that explode, dealing damage. Now, the last I looked at this, these echoes did bone damage. It's not clear if it's going to stay that way or if that's going to be 100% confirmed, so be on the lookout for updates on that. But if these echoes do deal bone damage, we get plenty more ossified bonuses from that, which causes those echoes to add into our bone damage scalars, reducing cooldowns, giving us all kinds of scalars and bonuses and stats and benefits across the board, which is really great. But it gives us more AoE and even a little bit more single target, which is really cool. For the chest armor, I recommend picking up Aspect of the Embalmer. Consuming a corpse has a chance to spawn a blood orb. So we like spawning blood orbs because we are going to pick up the corpse consuming bonuses and the blood orb consuming bonuses. Anytime you deal with blood orbs, it opens up options for you in the Paragon board where you can actually go and get some extra benefits from boards like Scent of Death and other. You can even go into some of the blood boards like up here attached to Scent of Death if you wanted, but that sort of thing. So getting blood orbs helps you out in very interesting ways as you move towards endgame. Accelerating Aspect is great for this. Critical strikes with core skills, Bone Spear, with increase your attack speed by up to 25% for 30 seconds. With good crit chance, you should be able to maintain this buff pretty often. And attack speed very heavily benefits for Bone Splinters and Bone Spear. The more you can spam your Builder and Spender on this basic build, the better you'll feel, the more damage you'll deal, the more proc chances you'll get, the more shards and fragments and shrapnel you'll create. You'll start becoming this machine gun of shedding out bone fragments and fractured pieces all over the screen. For the pants item, I think you should pick up the Aspect of Shilling Storm. This one means that when Bone Storm deals damage from either you or your gold, in the last I looked at it, you will be able to get an extra barrier. Extra takiness is nice. It does have some synergy options for running barrier fortified damage while having barrier builds, so that is an option if you want to look at it. For boots, there isn't a crazy amount of choices here for boots options. I think with any build that crits a lot, getting movement speed from Windstriker Aspect is great. You can also put this on Amulet, but I think that's a complete waste because Amulet is a very competitive slot for legendaries. So just getting this for boots I think fits here. You have a couple choices for defense or movement speed, but none of them are really all that build defining. Now, when it comes to weapon and offhand, I think this is a one-handed build because you want both Splintering Aspect and Aspect of Serration for this build. You can move those into accessories, but the accessories are really tight for legendaries. It's hard to pick the ones that are going to fit best. You really could, if you wanted to, get rid of your offhand, go two-handed for Splintering Aspect, and then move this up to maybe Grasping Veins and lose the crit chance and crit damage off of Tendrils. That's where we're at. So Splintering Aspect for your main weapon. Bone Spear's primary attack makes enemies hit beyond the first vulnerable. Bone Shards from Bone Spear deal bonus damage to vulnerable enemies and pierce them. So we get the vulnerable option from Bone Prison. Once we get higher up, we can actually get vulnerable from Bone Splinters, but also Bone Spear applies vulnerable by itself. You have to test it and feel for comfort if you're applying vulnerable enough. You get vulnerable from Bone Spear that penetrates, and then also the fragments that come out deal bonus damage to targets that are vulnerable that are already taking bonus damage because that's what vulnerable is. It's a damage amp. So combine that with a Bone Spear and it just starts, like I said, that's why it's Bone Shrapnel. There's just fragments flying all over the room. It's like a nail grenade from TF2 or TF1 going off. Aspect Serration is for your key passive. The Ossified Essence key passive also increases crit damage by 1% per essence up to a maximum. So if you have max essence when you spend, you will be able to get more crit damage. And with a bone build, you have high crit. You're getting a lot of damage increase from this. Grasping Veins is an easy pickup if you're running with the Corpse Tendrils, which we are. This one is when you do Corpse Tendrils, you get crit chance and you deal crit damage to targets affected by it, which is super cool. And again, the last I looked at this, it's hard to know if things are going to change a lot with release or not. The last I looked at this did apply to bosses. Even if bosses aren't pulled by the Corpse Tendrils, they do still apply that bonus. But again, we'd have to test again when the game is out to see if that is still the way that it works. Osseous Gale. Bone Storm consumes corpses to increase its duration by a certain amount. So by consuming corpses, remember we're running with a bone golem that spawns corpses. We're also making it so that when you consume a corpse, you spawn a blood orb. So on top of that is consuming there. So consuming that increases the damage of Bone Storm because it lasts longer. You bridge the gap between the cooldown for Bone Storm, which is already a shorter cooldown for an ultimate, but it means that as you're consuming those corpses, you're extending the duration, which means that your downtime of Bone Storm gets reduced, which is really great. You have tons of bone damage coming out from you and your golem, which gives you all your ossified benefits, which is nice. And then Aspect of Bursting Bones, when a segment of Bone Prison is destroyed or expires, so either it gets destroyed by enemies attacking it, or it runs out and all the fragments explode, it deals damage in the area on itself. I haven't been able to confirm if this is bone damage, but if this actually is, and I think it is bone damage, that's going to be even better because, again, our ossified passives trigger off of bone damage. More bone damage we have, we can even scale bone damage that way. This is great. This one probably becomes a little less slam dunk win if it is just magic damage or something. But I think it is bone damage. If that turns out to be different once we actually get a hold of the game, then kind of keep an eye out for that. You may want to swap this out. You can also put in the Expectant Legendary, which is spending for your essence, which is great because you build essence, spend essence. There's a couple options there. You can also move Serration up to Amulet, get a two-hander for Splintering Aspect, and not run an offhand, which all of that can work really well. Next, let's talk about the Paragon board. I've gone ahead and done a first draft of the Paragon for the Bone Spear build. It's a little bit different, actually quite a lot different than the previous one that we did. It has less glyphs as well, because there's less nodes that we're going to get from benefiting from that. And keep in mind that this is just a first pass. For bone builds, we like running intelligence and dexterity because for necromancers, intelligence gives us skill damage and dexterity gives us crit. That crit is very nice. We have a lot of things that trigger from crit. So as your gear gets better, your crit gets higher, and then crit damage gets more value as well, which is super cool. So this is, a very early rough draft on the Paragon, but I wanted to include it for people that use Bone Shrapnel all the way through their play, and they get to endgame, they unlock their Paragon boards, or they get to 50 and they unlock their Paragon boards. They're wondering what to do. At least I have a build for you that you can look at, and has plenty of synergies built in for this build. It just may need tweaking once we get a hold of the game. So I'll have a video going over Paragon boards and what they mean and all that. But for now, we're going to go toward the right here and pick this up. And again, we want mostly intelligence and dexterity for this build, with willpower being a nice secondary because it gives us essence generation. So more willpower means we get more essence, intelligence gives us more damage, and dexterity gives us more crit. All of that works really well for the build, so we want to try and get those as we go along. The first glyph that we're going to pick up is Essence Glyph. For every 5 dexterity purchased within range, core skills deal increased crit strike damage. And if you have at least 25 dexterity, that gets increased to enemies that are not healthy. Anytime you have these kind of constant DPS builds, which this Bone Shrapnel build is, it's not bursty, it's constant damage. There's just fragments and nails flying all over the screen. Dealing damage to injured targets gets more valuable because you're spending a lot of time just ticking down their HP. For burst builds, dealing damage to targets that are healthy is great because your upfront damage is in a single hit, so you get that scaled up, which is really nice. But remember that for every 5 dexterity purchased within range, you're going to get that benefit. So we like getting dex, 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 dex. All of these dex nodes will give us, each one gives us crit damage on our core skills, which is Bone Spear. Super nice. The first one you're going to pick up is the one that works best for your build, which is Bone Graft. This one focuses on bone skills and bone damage. It's going to be the first board you have, and it's the board you spend the most points on because it gives you the most benefit. So we're going to come over, we're going to grab the glyph slot. For this, we're going to run Exploit, which is you deal increased damage to vulnerable targets. Remember that we have vulnerable from our skills, but also we have the legendary that makes Bone Spear apply vulnerable, which gives us even more damage scaling on that. And if you have 25 dexterity in this area, dealing damage to vulnerability increases your damage by a percentage up to 10. So it's more damage scaling on top of damage scaling on top of damage scaling. These crossbones tell you that it is a bone, so we're going to get some damage scaling here for bone skills, more dexterity for crit, more defense resistances, and we just want to pick up as many of these dex nodes in this range that you see right here to make that scale as best we can. We also want max essence and essence on kill from these nodes here. Very valuable, very important. Same thing goes for crit strike damage on bone for these, and you can see that it is a bone skill. You get bonus effects for having a certain amount of intelligence and dexterity. That's what we're looking for. And with this Paragon build you have listed here on this build sheet, we hit both of these, which means we get even more crit strike damage for bone skills. We do want to come up and get the legendary node as well, which is hitting enemies with bone skills increases your damage and max essence, stacking up to a maximum. Super nice. Remember, we have increased damage for how much essence we had above 50 for the ossified passive. Also, if you run expectant, it gives you more. So having more maximum essence gives you more value, okay? And then we have some more damage for bone here and some defense for potion as well. And then for this, I think you can actually just go straight across for the next few boards that you pick up. I actually think, unlike Bone Spirit, there's value in going Hulking Monstrosity for this, making your golem a little bit tankier, because we're going to spawn corpses with him. We want him to live longer. We want him to stay alive, which is nice. And he's going to do some decent damage as well, being a bone golem. So we have that extra benefit there. We're going to pick up damage while active, defense for us while active. And we'll go over here for the rare glyph and pick up minion damage for you and the minion as well, and pick up these golem armor bonuses and golem damage. This just kind of gives you more value out of the golem. It could be once we get to test these builds on super late game, fully maxed out, that you won't need as much points in Hulking Monstrosity, but I think this makes the most sense for the Bone Spear build. We're gonna cut over to Scent of Death. We make it so that when there's no corpses nearby, you deal increased damage. When there are corpses nearby, you get damage reduction. Free damage, free damage reduction, and again, because you're killing targets at range, with room-wide AoEs, you can stay away from the corpses, get damage bonus, and you can also get benefits from having the corpse consumption that you get from the Bone Storm legendary that consumes corpses and gets them out of the way, which is really nice. You can also get damage to injured enemies. Remember, it's a tick DPS, uptime kind of build, so injured enemies scaling is really, really good for us. You can also do crit damage and damage to healthy as well, which helps against bosses and dealing damage to elites that have higher HP values. And then some defense. We're going to cut over to Flesh Eater, which means that when we consume 5 corpses, we get increased damage. Big damage increase, and a lot of that just comes from being able to consume the corpses with Bone Storm, which should trigger the passive and give us that damage bonus. It's huge, and just by playing normally, you'll get that benefit as well. So we're going to come all the way across there. Again, this is a first pass on the Paragon boards based on the build that we have, but that is my Bone Shrapnel build and all the synergies and everything explained and put together. So if you got value out of this video, leave a like down below. If you're running Bone Shrapnel when the game comes out, let me know. I'd be happy to hear about it. Join the Discord, come hang out with me on live stream. You know the deal. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.